I'd like to tell you something about the project we're working with at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden. We're a botanic garden in the far south of Florida, so we dip into the northern edge of the Caribbean region. And we're about 25 degrees north, so not technically tropical, but because we're surrounded by water, we can grow most tropical plants quite successfully. And Florida, southern Florida is very young geologically, and so it's not nearly as diverse as much of the rest of the Caribbean region. But because we have the climate to grow a lot of Caribbean plants, we've been working with Caribbean plants for many, many years. And the reason why a lot of gardens in the temperate zone are keen to work with plants in the tropics is simply because most of the plants in the world are in the tropics. And so if you combine all the tree species of Europe, North America, and Asia in the temperate zone, you'd have about 1,100. And you get that many tree species in only half a square kilometer of Borneo or a quarter square kilometer of Ecuador, which is similar to the biodiversity you see here in Colombia in its richest forests. So if an alien species were looking at Earth and the biodiversity here, you'd be interested in the tropics, and all of humankind should be focused on the tropics because this is where everything is. And among the tropical zones of the world, the major tropical zones, the Americas has the most species of plants and most other organisms. And if you look, we have almost over twice the diversity of tropical Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and also Southeast Asia. And even if you added Australia and India to Southeast Asia, it's still not as diverse as the tropics of the Americas. So we're in a very, very special place, and a place that we should be focusing on conserving this extraordinary biodiversity. And another aspect I want to highlight about conservation horticulture is not only should we be focusing on the tropics as we are here, but we can do work on plants much more effectively than with most other organisms. And one interesting measure that I've been looking at for some years now is you look at the species that have been documented extinct for plants, which on the IUCN Red List, which is now 129, so completely extinct, no longer surviving anywhere, even in gardens, whereas the number of species that are just extinct in the wild but survive in cultivation. And so we can say that without cultivation, we'd have, it'd be 35% greater amount of plant extinction. Whereas with animals, if you look at this at the similar measure, it's only, working with animals in zoos and other controlled environments only improves the rate of extinction by 5%. So, we're 7 times more effective with plants because plants have a lot of advantages for us working with them in controlled situations for propagation. And because plants are very easy to clone, we can grow them from cuttings, and we can grow them from seed, and plants don't age physiologically, meaning that we don't have to worry that a plant we're growing from cuttings, was the first cutting we got from the wild was 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. It can still reproduce and can still be shared and can still be reintroduced into the wild. So plants are the best renewable resource we have. But one concern for our gardens that are in areas outside the tropics or in less diverse parts of the tropics is, is it a risk for us to be growing and trying to conserve plants from tropical areas in terms of invasiveness? And we did a little study, a collaborative study among several institutions some years ago, about 15 years ago or so, and looking at the long history of plant introduction to South Florida, because being the only tropical area of the continental US, there's been a lot of interest in trying to grow tropical plants for all over the world there for over a century. And we used a modification of the Australian weed risk assessment plant and compared our conservation plants that we were working with in conservation horticulture to our horticultural introductions, which were more for general horticulture and for ornamental purposes. And we found the conservation plants had a much lower weed risk assessment score, which is this left axis on the left-hand side here. And the horticultural plants scored higher, but still it was fairly low, still in the low risk category for the most part. So it's for most plants, it's quite safe to work with them outside their native habitat. And this shows that same, some of that data in a little differently, exactly where the plants scored in terms of, so even with the horticultural plants, we only had a very small number that were in the reject for being high risk for invasiveness. And with conservation plants, which are generally rare and have limited distributions, working with them outside their native habitat is very low risk for any kind of invasiveness, just because they are, they're needing some help to reproduce in the first place. And a couple of examples of very low scoring species, some endangered, threatened species of the Caribbean, Crotonfish lockii and Buxus valii. And it's sometimes very, very helpful to grow plants outside where they're native, because sometimes terrible things happen, such as Turti just told us about the devastation of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And one of the victims of that was one of their endangered species, Solanum encepholium. There are only a handful of them left in Puerto Rico before Hurricane Maria, and Hurricane Maria destroyed what was left of that population. But fortunately, some of those plants were grown at Fairchild, and though they didn't survive a hurricane at Fairchild back in 2005, they were grown from cuttings from the Fairchild plants, went to the University of Connecticut, and they kept them alive all these years, and they've since been returned to Puerto Rico, propagations. And so if someone hadn't decided to share cuttings to a couple of different gardens, this wouldn't have survived. So ex situ conservation horticulture can be a very helpful supplement to in situ work. Another great example of that was one demonstrated by the Missouri Botanic Garden some years ago, a plant that we also grow at Fairchild, Dracaena umbraculifera, that's been in cultivation for about 200 years, and no one really knew where it came from. They thought maybe from Mauritius, and thanks to work at Missouri, they found out that it actually is native to Madagascar, and were then able to actually locate the wild population, a surviving plant. So this plant was actually discovered in the wild due to being cultivated and then studied in cultivation. So we can, information flow can go both ways. And, but when we're growing plants ex situ and working with conservation horticulture, one of the key aspects is making sure that we're capturing as much genetic diversity as we can we've been doing work trying to assess that on one Caribbean endemic, Adelea crasispefa, which is the only oil palm native to the Caribbean. It's endemic to Haiti, and which has been in cultivation from a couple seed introductions in the 90s into South Florida. And thanks to work that was spearheaded by Dr. Brett Jestro and William Sinea, we worked on assessing the natural biodiversity of the species in Haiti. There are two major populations, and then comparing them to the cultivated plants. It turned out that our cultivated plants in South Florida generally only represented one of these populations, and showing that, if this work were being done again, we should sample both of these populations in the wild that were separated by a genetic bottleneck, so they each had quite a few unique alleles. So it's important to use the technologies we have now to assess the quality of our conservation work and to design better procedures. But at Fairchild, we also do a lot of work on our own local native plants. And so we are engaging with the community for conservation and restoration work. And we do a lot of work with our native ferns and also ferns of Puerto Rico. We have Jennifer Posley is an expert in fern conservation, and we also work on our local cacti, which are quite threatened. And but we're also very focused on trying to inspire a new generation of botanists and plant conservationists. And one of the ways we're doing that is to find plants that are charismatic and projects that are charismatic that really will get students and children excited. One of those is our Million Orchid Project, which is an attempt to restore the native orchids of South Florida to the trees. of our urban environment so that people will be able to interact with them and enjoy them and study them. And we do this with schools all over the region, hundreds of schools in several counties. And we have a mobile tissue culture lab called the STEM Lab, which is a refurbished school bus that's been retrofitted to be able to do tissue culture, so we can bring this from school to school where they don't have the facilities to do it. And it's been a big success. And we're also do a lot of work with preserving horticultural diversity, which is another aspect of plant conservation that's very important. There's a lot of plant diversity of our utilized crops, such as mangoes, that because only a few varieties generally become commercial and global in our globalized system and get shipped all over the world. A lot of the local varieties are in need of conservation at various institutions, so we work with that too in our Fairchild Farm, and then distributing some of our mango diversity to the public. And the importance of this is illustrated by another botanic garden in the U.S., the National Tropical Botanic Garden in Hawaii, which, thanks to their Breadfruit Institute, has preserved a lot of the varieties of the breadfruit, which are very important for tropical food everywhere, that were starting to go locally extinct in the 80s and 90s. And thanks to their work, they've conserved several hundred cultivars, many of which had gone extinct in their home islands and can now be reintroduced and shared with the world. And other aspects of, we're also going directly to the schools to educate future botanists and inspire future plant conservationists through the Fairchild Challenge, which gets students involved in natural history projects in schools all throughout Florida and throughout the US and now internationally. And we also have a very exciting pioneering secondary school called the Biotech High School that works both with the zoo in Miami and with Fairchild. And students in high school can decide to specialize either in zoology or botany during their secondary school years. And surprisingly enough, a large portion, in fact, early on the school, most of the students were selecting to work in botany more than with animals, which surprised everybody. So, giving students an opportunity to work hands-on with plants and get inspired that way is early in their education is really critical. And another way we've been getting more and more interest with students in plants is kind of surprising. It's looking at growing plants in space in collaboration with NASA. And you might think this looks kind of unusual because we have so much work to do here on Earth. But one of the best ways to appreciate just how special Earth is to start to figure out all the challenges of how to grow plants in space, which is extremely hostile to all forms of life. And so it does help students realize that we are this special, very special little skin of atmosphere in a very difficult universe, and we need to preserve what we have. And it also helps students get introduced to new technologies for growing plants. And so a lot of this work is building on a lot of the early vision that David Fairchild, who our garden is named after, who was really trying to inspire people to get into appreciating the incredible diversity of tropical plants of the world. And his books were an early attempt at that. And I love some of the quotes he had, like he said, "I shall be content if a perusal of its pages, this book he wrote on exploring for plants, shall convert a single person to the romantic life a deep study of the plants can give." And we all appreciate that, and hopefully can continue to share this kind of deep love of plants with all the people in our different countries, and ultimately to inspire people to change the world and make it a better place and a greener place. Thank you very much.
Questions? I'll stand here for a minute. Thank you, Chad. It was really impressive. I love all the work that Fairchild is doing. And I have one question. How have any of these high school students ever come back, I don't know, maybe as biologists, botanists? Like, have you seen any impact, long-term impact of all the school programs?
Yeah, we're just beginning to see it. This is a very young school, so it's only about, I think it's 7 years old. So a lot of these students are still starting in college and whatnot. But I know that some of them are going into botany or going into related environmental science programs. And we have one, I know we have a couple of students. I think one of them actually works with our Million Orchid Project a lot now. And he was a graduate of the biotech school. So I know we're starting to see it, but it's still very early, but they're encouraging signs.
Chad, this is inspiring, the work that you're doing at Fairchild. Just a question for you. Are there international opportunities for the connection of your outreach, your student outreach programs to other regions, perhaps?
Oh yes, definitely. We're now both the Fairchild Challenge and the Growing Beyond Earth project have been they're now in several other countries as well, and they are working with other schools. I'm not sure exactly which ones they are, but I know we're in about 5 or 6 countries now. And I think anyone who gets in touch with us, we're glad to work with you to get started. Absolutely.
Okay. A quick announcement for our speakers. Actually, can we give Chad a hand?